In an empty subway station, a man named Andreas Ramsfjell watches a couple emotionlessly make out. In discomfort, Andreas looks away from the unsettling scene. The subway train arrives at full speed, and Andreas jumps toward it. At an abandoned gas station in the middle of nowhere, a man puts up a welcome banner. A bus arrives at the gas station and drops off Andreas, leaving him confused. The man returns and takes down the banner now that Andreas has arrived. The man heads to his car, and the curious Andreas follows him. Andreas introduces himself to the man and asks if the banner was for him. The man says it is since he's been expecting him. The two men get in the man's car and drive off. Afterward, the man ensures that Andreas is comfortable. Andreas questions where they're going, so the man says they're heading to his place. Later that night, they finally arrive at an apartment complex. The man tells Andreas the details of his apartment room since Andreas will be staying there from now on. Then, he gives Andreas the apartment keys and the location of his new job. Andreas asks what his job will be, so the man says he'll be an accountant. The man asks if there's any problem, and Andreas says no, so he gets out of the car. The man says Andreas will get used to it, then leaves. Upon entering the apartment, Andreas looks around and finds a fully furnished home with clothes just for him. He goes to the restroom and decides to shave his beard. Moments later, he lies in bed and stares blankly ahead. The next morning, Andreas goes to work and is greeted by Havard. Havard shows him around and asks Andreas if he wants to see his office. However, Andreas requests to meet his boss, and Havard says he's the boss. New to the corporation, Andreas meets his co-workers Harold, Vigdis, and Ivar. The two finally reach Andreas' office, so Havard gives him cash until he gets a bank account. The boss leaves, and Andreas gets settled in his new workplace. Hours later, Andreas takes a break and goes outside to eat. After, he heads back to work when he suddenly notices a dead man pierced through the gate from jumping off a building. Despite the accident, he observes that the people around him don't seem to care about the situation. He sees the city cleaners retrieving the corpse and cleaning the blood. Andreas heads back to his office and looks down the street, finding it cleaned by maintenance. Later that night, Andreas goes to a bar and drinks. He heads to the restroom and urinates, then notices a man on the floor who just vomited. Andreas strikes a conversation and says he thinks there's something wrong with the drinks as if it's watered down. The man says there's nothing wrong with it, but Andreas says he's been drinking all night, yet he's still sober. Unexpectedly, a man in the cubicle agrees with Andreas since he's also not drunk despite spending all his money on booze. The man on the floor tells Andreas not to believe the other guy, saying he's drunk. The man in the cubicle says he tried everything, but nothing tastes good, just like his favorite, hot chocolate, which doesn't taste like anything. Andreas washes his hands while listening, and the man on the floor leaves, saying he'll get used to it. Interested, Andreas peeks under the cubicle and sees the man wearing black and white brogue shoes. Suddenly, two men enter the restroom and stare at Andreas, so Andreas gets up and leaves. Moments later, Andreas sneakily follows the man wearing black and white shoes to his home. The man enters his apartment and turns on the lights, and Andreas sees the window to his room. Andreas approaches until he hears music, so he leans closer to listen. Later on, Andreas eats dinner at home while watching TV. He smells his food and eats it, realizing the man in the cubicle was right. The next day at work, Andreas cuts paper with a paper cutter machine. He puts his finger under the blade to feel pain, and the cutter slices his finger off. Andreas exclaims he's hurt as he gushes out blood. His co-workers come to him, but they are undisturbed by his injury. Harold arrives and asks what happened until Andreas passes out. Later that day, Andreas wakes up in a car with the city cleaners with his treated hand. He apologizes for the trouble, but the cleaners ignore him. They drop Andreas off at his apartment, and he goes home. At his restroom, Andreas unwraps the bandaging and finds his finger intact. After, he lies in bed, wondering how that happened. The following morning, Andreas heads back to the deserted gas station. He spies at a distance and spots someone getting off the bus as the man welcomes him. Andreas follows the bus until the bus gets out of sight, confused about where it went. He gets out of the car and reaches the end of the tire tracks, leading nowhere. At work, his co-workers greet him, and Harold offers Andreas a brownie. He takes a brownie, goes to his office, and finds his boss. Havard makes sure Andreas is alright and tells him to take breaks whenever he wants. The boss leaves. Andreas gets to work, then looks down at the street, remembering the incident. During lunch, Andreas eats alone as he watches his co-workers eat together. He decides to sit with them, and the rest talk about couches in a furniture magazine. They point out what they like until Andreas points to a couch, leaving the rest speechless. He says it looks comfortable, and Vigdis says it's too casual. Harold thinks it could go well with minimalist designs, and the rest agree. Havard invites Andreas for dinner at his place tonight, and he gladly accepts it. After work, Andreas passes by the window of the man in the cubicle he once followed. He approaches the window and tries to listen closely. The cleaners ask him if there's anything wrong, so Andreas says no and leaves. That night, Andreas arrives at Havard's home. They silently eat dinner, so Andreas starts conversing with Ann-Britt, the beautiful woman beside him. He asks her what she does, and the woman says she sells kitchen interiors and is taking an interior design class. Andreas asks her out on a date, and she gleefully says yes. After dinner, Andreas walks Ann-Britt home. She bids farewell, but she asks if he wants to go inside. Afterward, they go inside and intimately make love. The next day at work, Andreas brings a plant to his office. Later that day, he moves in with Ann-Britt, and they share a kiss. As the couple begins a new relationship, they make love and renovate the house. Days later, the two host dinner with their friends. The woman notices the tiles on the kitchen wall and asks if the color is azure. However, Andreas says it's coral since manufacturers name their colors. Later on, the couple shares an intimate night. After, Andreas puts away the dishes, and Ann-Britt tells him she doesn't like the white color in the living room. Hours later, he wakes up in the middle of the night and goes to the living room. Ann-Britt checks on him, so he says he woke up from a strange dream. He starts to explain his dream, but Ann-Britt intervenes, saying she doesn't want him to talk about it. Andreas is confused about why, but she insists he stop. She changes the topic and says there are many renovations left to do, as her boyfriend remains silent. At work the next day, Andreas stares at Ingeborg, his blonde colleague, during lunch. Back home, Ann-Britt asks Andreas if they can put a bathtub in the bedroom, but Andreas doesn't seem to like the idea. She asks if he'd like it, and he hesitantly agrees. The following day at work, Andreas watches Ingeborg in the break room. He approaches her, and she asks if he's seen the tea bags. He says no and asks if she wants him to get some, so she says he doesn't need to. As Ingeborg leaves, Andreas asks her out to the movies, and she says yes. Ann-Britt receives a call from her boyfriend, who informs her that he'll be late tonight because he must run some errands. Ann-Britt doesn't mind, so they end the call. That night at the cinema, Andreas cries from the sorrowful movie. Meanwhile, the film doesn't seem to affect Ingeborg and the rest of the people. The woman leans on Andreas' shoulder while they continue watching. After the movie, Andreas drops Ingeborg home. She says she had a good time, but he claims the movie wasn't good. Then, Andreas asks her if she's uncomfortable with him living with someone else, so she mentions she doesn't mind since they haven't done anything wrong. The man then asks if they did, so she says it doesn't bother her. Andreas reaches in for a kiss, and the two passionately make out. They are interrupted by the door opening, so Ingeborg suggests she should head in already. Andreas asks if they can see each other again, and she accepts. He kisses her goodbye, goes to his car, and leaves. The following day, Andreas and Ingeborg eat ice cream outside during their break. She claims they need to head back to work, so Andreas says he'll wait a while so no one can see them together. They get up, and Andreas kisses her and says it would be nice not to hide their affair. Shortly after, he gets back to work. After work, Andreas goes home and finds Ann-Britt watching TV. He reveals that he met another woman, so Ann-Britt asks why. He claims he unexpectedly fell in love with someone at work and will leave Ann-Britt. However, Ann-Britt doesn't seem to be bothered by him loving someone else. She says they have guests on Saturday, so Andreas mentions he'll stay until that day. On Saturday, the guests arrive, and they eat together. That night, Andreas heads to Ingeborg's place with flowers and throws pebbles at her window. She wakes up, and he tells her to go down. Moments later, she goes down, and her suitor gives her flowers, saying he has a surprise for her. They arrive at a fancy restaurant, escorted by a waiter to their table. Andreas reveals he left Ann-Britt for her, so they can now move in together. Ingeborg doesn't react much, so he asks if she's happy, and she says yes. Andreas is excited that they don't have to meet in secret anymore, but Ingeborg hopes he didn't leave Ann-Britt for her. Andreas claims he did it for himself because it felt wrong. Their dinner arrives, and the man asks her if there's something since she isn't happy. Ingeborg admits that she didn't know they had a serious relationship, upsetting Andreas. Disappointed, he asks if there's someone else in her life, and she says yes. She reveals she has multiple affairs, leaving him hurt. Andreas doesn't criticize her because he was cheating on his girlfriend. He asks her if she would dump her affairs for him, and she says yes because they're not important to her. Andreas reassures her if she actually would and asks if she wants to move in with him. Ingeborg says she could, so he asks if he's more important than her affairs. However, she says all of them are nice without giving a direct answer. Andreas is left speechless, so he leaves. He heads to the subway station and sees a couple emotionlessly making out. He sees the train arriving, so he jumps on the tracks, hoping to get killed. Abruptly, the train stops before it hits him, and he gets up. Suddenly, the train moves and crushes him. Later on, Andreas wakes up severely injured on the tracks. Another train hits him as he gets caught underneath. Afterward, he lands near the end of the tunnel. Severely injured, he walks out and finds himself in the city again. A cleaner finds him and drops him off at Ann Britt's house. Andreas enters and finds Ann Britt, unbothered by his bloody appearance. She casually informs him that their friend invited them to go karting on Saturday. On Saturday, they go karting with their friends. Hours later, Andreas heads to the bar and drinks. After, he goes to the man's apartment that he followed before from the bar restroom. He hears the music and listens closely, so he decides to go in. Andreas finds the gate locked, so he enters through the back as the music gets louder. He knocks on the door, and the music suddenly stops. Andreas introduces himself as the man he met at the restroom. Hugo, a cleaner and the man in the cubicle, tells him to leave now that he's calmed. Andreas insists on letting him in, so Hugo opens the door. As Andreas enters, he's greeted by an old room full of light bulbs. Now that he's seen the room, Hugo tells him to leave. Andreas hears the music coming from the wall, so he leans closer. He traces the music to be behind a painting, and Hugo tells him not to tell anyone. Andreas removes the painting and sees a hole with light at the end. The man claims he discovered it months ago, and the music comes from there. Hugo warns him not to reach in since it could collapse and tells him not to tell anyone. Then, they listen to heavenly music. The following day, Havard checks on Andreas in his office. The boss asks Andreas if he's uncomfortable, so Andreas says he misses many things, such as children. He asks Havard if he remembers what a baby looks like, but the boss smiles and leaves. Shortly after, he calls Ann Britt and informs her that he'll be late tonight. After a while, Andreas heads to Hugo's room with a pickaxe and sledgehammer. He breaks the wall, but makes little progress. Hugo throws his garbage and hears loud drilling. He goes into his house and finds Andreas drilling through the wall. Hugo scolds him to stop because they'll get caught. They look through the hole, and Andreas smells something good and crawls inside. However, Hugo tells him to leave as Andreas removes the debris. Hours later, they continue to drill through and eventually rest. The men drink coffee inside the hole and hear children playing by the shore. At work the next morning, Andreas greets his coworker, but she ignores him. He goes to his office and finds another man there until Havard comes in. He tells Andreas that he has to start a new career, then bids him farewell. As Andreas leaves, he evades the cleaners and goes to Hugo's room. They continue digging, and an older man from the same building smells something through his vent. At the hole, light seeps out, and they hear a kid playing. Suddenly, they hear the door knock, so Hugo checks. A trio of elderly people show up at the door, claiming they smell and hear something. Hugo lies that he's repairing his house from a leak, then pushes them out. Meanwhile, more people on the street notice it through the window. Back in the room, Andreas and Hugo peek through the hole and hear someone. Hugo says he smells something, so Andreas continues to dig. Outside, more people gather by the window. Andreas sticks his hand inside the hole. On the other side, a bright and peaceful kitchen exists, and Andreas grabs a piece of cake. Unexpectedly, the cleaners pull Andreas out as he eats the cake he can finally taste. The cleaners bring the men out and drive them away, as Hugo reasons he wasn't involved. They stop at the city council and free Hugo, leaving Andreas in the car. The council comes out, and a woman approaches Andreas. She tells him that most people in the city are happy and content, but he ignores her. The woman goes to the group, and they deliberate on what to do with him. After their decision, the man who first brought Andreas to the city arrives and picks him up. The cleaners accompany him, and they drive off. Meanwhile, the cleaners cover up the hole in the wall. Andreas and the men arrive at the deserted gas station, and the cleaners bring Andreas to the back. The bus he first came from arrives, and the cleaners force Andreas to the bus compartment while the man welcomes the new person. The bus departs as Andreas experiences a rough ride inside. Meanwhile, in the city, Ann Britt enjoys her new relationship with another man. Then, Hugo continues being a cleaner. Ingeborg happily shares ice cream with her new affair. And lastly, Havard and Harold joyfully play badminton at home. Eventually, Andreas wakes up covered in frost. He opens the door and finds himself alone in a frozen wasteland.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.